My name is Aria Bennett. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the person people describe as steady. I live in Portland, Oregon, where I work as a financial compliance analyst for a mid-sized firm. It's not glamorous work. It's quiet, detail-oriented, and mostly invisible, much like me, if you ask my extended family. I've always been the calm one at gatherings, the one refilling drinks, washing dishes before anyone notices they've piled up, listening more than I speak. My relatives often joke that I'm too serious or too sensitive. They say I don't like attention, and they're right, I don't. But that doesn't mean I don't see what's happening around me, especially when it comes to my aunt. This story isn't about shouting matches across dining tables or dramatic confrontations. It's not about revenge in the way people usually imagine it. No screaming, no public meltdowns, no cinematic mic drops. It's about something much quieter. It's about what happens when someone slowly reshapes how others see you, through rumors so subtle they almost sound like concern. It's about being painted as unstable, irresponsible, unreliable by someone who smiles while doing it. And it's about what I chose to do when I realized that silence wasn't protecting me anymore. My Aunt Claudia has always been magnetic in a room. Charismatic, the storyteller, the one who organizes birthdays and holiday dinners and knows everyone's business. People trust her because she sounds confident, because she speaks first, because she fills the silence. I feel silent too, but differently. Over the course of a year, I began to notice something unsettling. Small comments from cousins, questions from my parents that didn't match anything I had told them, invitations that stopped coming, a shift in tone, subtle but undeniable. At first, I wondered if I was imagining it. Then I wondered if I deserved it. Eventually, I realized something else. The rumors weren't accidents. They were deliberate, carefully placed, and they were working. What my aunt didn't know, what no one in my family knew, was that I had spent the last decade professionally untangling financial discrepancies, reading between numbers the way some people read between lines. I understood patterns, leverage, documentation, and once I understood what she was doing, I made a decision. Not to scream, not to defend myself, not to beg anyone to believe me, but to let the truth surface in a way that couldn't be dismissed. This is the story of how my aunt spread rumors about me, and how I exposed her secret debts in front of the entire family, not to destroy her, but to end something that had been quietly destroying me. Have you ever stayed silent so long that people started mistaking your silence for weakness? In my family, I was the dependable one, not the successful one. That title belonged to my cousin Daniel, who built a tech startup and never let anyone forget it. Not the charismatic one, that was Aunt Claudia. Not the dramatic one, that rotated depending on the year. I was the one people called when they needed help moving apartments. The one who showed up early to set up folding chairs for backyard barbecues. The one who remembered birthdays without being reminded. Dependable is a compliment, but it's also a container. It means you're useful, predictable, safe, invisible. At family gatherings, I usually ended up at the edge of conversations, not excluded, just uninvited. I'd stand there holding a glass of sparkling water, smiling politely, while stories overlapped each other. When I did speak, someone louder would often cut in before I finished. It didn't sting the way people might imagine. I wasn't fragile, I simply adjusted. I learned to compress my thoughts into smaller sentences. I learned to speak after the laughter died down, not during it. Over time, they began narrating to me. Aria's so private. Aria doesn't like attention. She's just different. Different became code for distant. Distant became code for unstable. And unstable, well, that word started appearing in whispers I wasn't meant to hear. The truth was simpler. I preferred precision over performance. My job required it. At work, people listened when I spoke because mistakes cost money. My reports were read carefully. My emails are saved. My conclusions acted on. At home, I was a background texture. Aunt Claudia especially had a way of patting my shoulder while subtly reducing me. She's brilliant, she'd say to others, smiling warmly. But she gets overwhelmed easily. I never told her I wasn't overwhelmed. I was observing. There's a difference. When I bought my condo at 32, alone, Claudia told relatives I'd rushed into it because I was going through something. When I declined a cousin's spontaneous weekend trip because of a work deadline, she mentioned at dinner that I'd been isolating myself again. Again, I didn't remember the first time. I noticed small shifts over the years. Invitations phrased differently. Questions that felt like check-ins rather than conversations. Are you okay financially? Are you sure you're not working too hard? Do you have someone to talk to? They sounded caring. That's what made them powerful. Concern is the most socially acceptable disguise for control. Still, I didn't confront her. Part of me believed that if I just stayed steady long enough, the narrative would correct itself. Facts would outweigh tone. Reality would defeat suggestion. I underestimated how repetition works. If you say something enough times, even gently, people start looking for evidence to support it. So when I forgot to reply to a group text for a day, it confirmed that I was withdrawing. When I left a party early because I had an early meeting, it confirmed that I couldn't handle long social nights. I wasn't the main character in my family's story. I was the side note, and for a long time, I accepted that role because it felt easier than resisting it. I didn't yet understand that silence doesn't always protect your dignity. Sometimes it becomes the canvas on which other people paint. The first time I realized something was wrong, it didn't feel dramatic. It felt off. It was my cousin Mia's engagement dinner. A small gathering at a wine bar downtown. Soft lighting, long wooden table, too many shared plates. I had brought a gift. A leather-bound wedding planning journal I'd ordered weeks earlier after she mentioned wanting something classic, not Pinteresty. When I handed it to her, she hugged me tightly. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," I smiled. "I wanted to." The night moved on in waves of champagne and overlapping conversations. At one point, I stepped outside to take a call from work, a minor compliance question. 5 minutes, maybe 6. When I came back in, the energy at the table had shifted. Not tense, just subtly rearranged. A few eyes flicked toward me, then away. I slid into my seat. Claudia leaned over, her voice gentle. "We were just saying we're glad you came tonight," she said, touching my arm. "We weren't sure if you'd cancel last minute." I blinked. "Why would I cancel?" She gave a small laugh. "Oh, you've been overwhelmed lately." The word again. I felt heat rise in my chest, not anger, confusion. "I haven't canceled anything," I said carefully. Claudia tilted her head. "Of course, I just meant you've had a lot going on. You told me that, remember?" I hadn't, but the way she said it made it sound like I had simply forgotten my own confession. Mia jumped in quickly. "It's okay, Aria, we totally get it. Work stress, life stuff. Life stuff." There it was. A category broad enough to hold anything, vague enough to imply something. I searched my memory for the conversation Claudia was referencing. Had I vented? Had I mentioned being tired? Everyone gets tired. I smiled lightly. "I'm fine, really." And the table moved on. That should have been the end of it. A minor misunderstanding, a misplaced assumption. But later that night, when I was rinsing wine glasses in Mia's kitchen because I always gravitated toward cleanup, Daniel wandered in. He lowered his voice. "Hey, if you ever need a referral to someone, let me know." "A referral for what?" He hesitated. Just someone to talk to. The second cut is always sharper than the first. I dried my hands slowly. "Did Aunt Claudia say something?" Daniel shrugged in that careless way that means yes. "Nothing bad, just that you've been struggling more than you let on." Struggling? With what? I drove home that night, replaying every recent interaction in my mind. I had met my deadlines, paid my mortgage early, renewed my gym membership, scheduled my annual physical. My life was orderly, almost boringly stable. But stability doesn't defend itself loudly. Rumors don't arrive labeled as rumors. They arrive disguised as context. She's just going through something. She doesn't always tell the full story. She's fragile lately. Each sentence plants doubt, not accusation. Doubt spreads more efficiently. That was the first small cut. Not an insult, not a confrontation. Just the realization that a version of me was being introduced into rooms before I arrived. And I had no idea what else had already been said. I didn't confront Claudia the next day, or the next week. Instead, I started listening differently. Because when someone rewrites you quietly, the first thing you need to understand is the pattern. After the engagement dinner, I told myself it was nothing. Families exaggerate. Words get twisted. Maybe Claudia had misinterpreted something I'd said months ago and built a narrative around it. That felt more comfortable than assuming intent. So I did what I've always done. I adjusted. When relatives asked if I was holding up okay, I smiled and said yes. When someone joked that I work too much because I'm avoiding real life, I laughed softly instead of correcting them. I didn't want to be defensive. Defensive people look guilty, even when they aren't. But something had shifted. At Thanksgiving that year, I arrived with homemade pecan pie and a bottle of wine. Claudia was already in the kitchen, orchestrating dishes like a conductor. She greeted me warmly, too warmly. "There she is," she announced, "and she looks rested. That's good." Rested. I had worked a 10-hour day before driving over. During dinner, conversation drifted toward finances, mortgage rates, inflation, rising grocery costs. I mentioned refinancing earlier that year to secure a lower rate. It was a simple comment. Factual. Claudia smiled across the table. "Oh, I'm so proud of you for handling all that paperwork on your own," she said. "I know forms can be overwhelming for you." My fork paused midair. "Overwhelming?" I repeated gently. "Well, you've always said numbers stress you out. I work in financial compliance. Numbers are my profession." I felt the table's attention flicker toward me, then back to their plates. No one challenged her. Why would they? She sounded supportive. That's the brilliance of it. The disrespect was wrapped in praise. "You're so brave for managing your own bills. We're glad you're stable right now. You seem better lately." Better than what? The comments were small enough to dismiss individually, but together they created a soft outline around me. Emotionally fragile, financially uncertain, quietly struggling. And because I didn't object loudly, it became normalized. I started noticing changes in how people spoke to me. Slower, simpler, like I might break under complex topics. When investment opportunities came up, no one asked my opinion anymore. When family planning discussions happened, I wasn't included in the advice circle. I had been downgraded, not by confrontation, by repetition. The strange part was how easily I rationalized it. Maybe Claudia is just worried. Maybe she's trying to protect me. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. That last one is powerful. It keeps you silent longer than anything else. One evening, my mother called. "Sweetheart," she began carefully, "your aunt mentioned you've been having trouble managing things alone. You know you can move back home if you need to." I sat on my couch staring at the wall. "I'm not having trouble," I said calmly. There was a pause on the other end, a gentle disbelief. "Of course," she replied, "if that's what you feel. If that's what you feel, not what is true." I ended the call and opened my laptop. Not to work, but to think. I began replaying conversations like data points, dates, locations, exact phrases. I wrote them down in my black leather notebook. Not out of anger, out of clarity. When disrespect becomes routine, people stop noticing it, including you. But I was starting to notice something else. Claudia never made these comments when we were alone, only when there was an audience. And that detail mattered, because it meant this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was positioning. It took me months to articulate it, but once I did, I couldn't unsee it. I had been assigned a role, not formally, not maliciously in an obvious way, but consistently. In every family system, there are archetypes: the achiever, the peacemaker, the rebel, the golden child, the unstable one, the responsible one. I had always been the responsible one. Somewhere along the way, Claudia adjusted the script. Responsible became fragile but functioning. Independent became isolated. Private became secretive. She didn't remove my strengths. She reframed them. And because I rarely contradicted her publicly, the new role settled into place like furniture no one remembered buying. At Christmas dinner, I watched it happen in real time. We were sitting around my parents' dining table. Candlelight flickered against polished wood. Conversation drifted toward travel plans for the following summer. My cousin Mia suggested a group trip to Italy. "It would be so good for all of us," she said excitedly. "Aria, you should definitely come. It might help you. Loosen up." There it was again. Loosen up. Before I could respond, Claudia chimed in gently. "Only if she feels up to it. Big trips can be overwhelming." The table nodded sympathetically. Overwhelming. No one asked me directly. No one said, "Aria, what do you think?" They had already decided what I would think. In that moment, I saw the architecture of it clearly. Claudia wasn't attacking me. She was curating me. By subtly lowering expectations, she positioned herself as the emotionally stable center of the family, the capable one, the reliable narrator. If I were fragile, she was strong. If I was uncertain, she was decisive. Contrast builds credibility, and the more they perceived me as slightly unstable, the more grounded she appeared. It was strategic, quiet, almost elegant. What unsettled me most wasn't anger. It was the realization that I had been participating in it. Every time I laughed off a comment, every time I downplayed my achievements, every time I chose harmony over correction, I reinforced the role. There's a strange comfort in being underestimated. Expectations are low, pressure decreases, you're allowed to fade into the background. But invisibility comes with a cost. When my promotion at work was announced, a significant one, with a salary increase and leadership responsibilities, I mentioned it casually in the family group chat. Claudia responded first. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I hope it's not too much pressure for you." The message collected heart emojis. No follow-up questions, no celebration. Pressure. I stared at my phone longer than I'd like to admit. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not outwardly, not dramatically, just internally. I realized I was no longer being misunderstood. I was being managed. And the role I'd been assigned, reliable, useful, slightly unstable, served everyone except me. The question wasn't whether I could confront it. The question was whether I was willing to keep living inside it. The shift didn't happen at a family dinner. It didn't happen during an argument. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in my office, under fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly unreal. I was reviewing a client's financial disclosures, cross-checking declared assets against credit reports and public filings. It's the kind of work that requires patience. You look for patterns, gaps, small inconsistencies that don't match the narrative being presented. The client was a local business owner who had claimed temporary cash flow issues. On paper, everything looked stable, revenue steady, assets intact. But the debt told a different story. Hidden lines of credit, high-interest personal loans masked as business expenses, a series of minimum payments structured to delay collapse. He wasn't broke. He was leveraged beyond what he could admit publicly. I leaned back in my chair and felt something click into place. Not about him, about Claudia. Over the past year, I had overheard her drop subtle comments about tightening budgets and being careful with investments. She had mentioned helping friends navigate financial stress. She positioned herself as financially savvy, composed, and above instability. But there were moments, tiny ones, that hadn't aligned. A credit card was declined once at a cafe, brushed off as a bank glitch. A hurried phone call she took outside during Thanksgiving. A casual remark about refinancing again. Again, most people don't refinance repeatedly unless something underneath is shifting. I wasn't looking for dirt. That's important. I wasn't plotting revenge in that office chair. I wasn't fantasizing about confrontation. I was simply recognizing a pattern I knew professionally. Projection is common in financial distress. People who feel unstable often assign instability to someone else. It redistributes scrutiny. The thought settled slowly. What if the narrative about me wasn't random? What if it were insulation? I didn't open my laptop to search for her name that day. I didn't pull any reports. I just sat with the possibility. If Claudia was struggling financially and hiding it, then painting me as unstable would serve a purpose. It would subtly lower my credibility. If I ever contradicted her, people would already question my reliability. It was strategic. And if it was strategic, then it was intentional. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me calm. Because once you understand intent, you stop personalizing behavior. I went home that evening and opened my black leather notebook. I flipped through pages of documented phrases, dates, and gatherings. For the first time, I added a new heading, projection. Under it, I listed observations, not accusations, just facts. Multiple refinancing mentions in 18 months, increased commentary on financial caution, subtle deflection when asked about travel plans, growing emphasis on my supposed instability. The pattern wasn't complete yet, but it was forming. And for the first time in a year, I didn't feel confused. I felt oriented. There's a quiet power in realizing you're not crazy, that the shifts you've sensed are real, that your memory hasn't failed you. I didn't confront her the next weekend. I didn't hint that I knew anything. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I stopped defending myself internally. If she were constructing a story, I didn't need to interrupt it prematurely. I just needed to understand why. That Tuesday wasn't dramatic. No one raised their voice. No one cried. But it was the day I stopped being a passive character in someone else's version of me and started observing the author. Before that Tuesday, my silence had been reactive. I stayed quiet to avoid conflict, to keep dinners smooth, to prevent my mother from worrying. My restraint came from a desire to preserve harmony. After that Tuesday, my silence became intentional. There's a difference between not speaking because you're unsure and not speaking because you're gathering. At the next family gathering, a birthday brunch for my uncle, I watched Claudia carefully, not suspiciously, calmly. She arrived 10 minutes late, apologizing lightly. "Bank meeting ran long," she said, waving it off with a practiced laugh. "You know how these things are." No one asked follow-up questions. Later, while plates were being cleared, she placed a gentle hand on my shoulder again. "How are you holding up with the new promotion?" she asked, voice soft enough to signal concern, but loud enough for others to hear. "Good," I replied evenly. "Just remember not to take on too much. You have a tendency to overextend when you're anxious." Anxious. There it was, another brick in the wall. This time, I didn't correct her. I didn't smile it away either. I simply looked at her, held eye contact for half a second longer than usual, and said, "I manage pressure professionally." It wasn't confrontational, it wasn't sharp. It was factual. She blinked, just once, then laughed lightly. "Of course you do." But she shifted her posture, slightly, That was when I understood something crucial. She expected compliance, not resistance, not even subtle clarification. My new silence unsettled her more than an argument would have. Over the following weeks, I changed nothing externally. I still attended gatherings, still helped in the kitchens, still brought thoughtful gifts. But internally, I detached. When relatives asked if I was doing better lately, I responded with neutral clarity. I've been stable for years, I would say gently. No sarcasm, no defensiveness, just a correction. Most people don't argue with calm specificity. It doesn't give them traction. Meanwhile, I began paying attention to timing. Claudia's comments about my supposed instability increased whenever conversations drifted toward finances, especially her finances. If someone mentioned rising credit card interest rates, she'd pivot. Well, Aria knows how overwhelming that can feel. If someone discussed investment risks, she'd glance at me sympathetically. We all handle stress differently. The redirection was elegant, subtle enough to avoid scrutiny, frequent enough to shape perception. And here's what fascinated me most. She believed her own narrative. Projection isn't always malicious in a cinematic way. Sometimes it's survival. If she was carrying financial strain, real, measurable strain, then shifting attention away from herself wasn't cruelty. It was a strategy. That realization didn't soften my resolve, but it removed bitterness. I wasn't dealing with a villain. I was dealing with someone protecting an image. And images are fragile when numbers don't support them. My silence gave her confidence at first. I could see it. She grew slightly bolder, slightly more comfortable speaking for me. She's just figuring things out. She's sensitive about money. She doesn't always tell us the whole story. Each phrase was cataloged quietly in my notebook. Because silence, when chosen, becomes space. And space allows patterns to fully reveal themselves. She thought my quiet meant submission. It meant documentation. She thought my lack of confrontation meant weakness. It meant timing. There's a particular kind of power in letting someone underestimate you while you're paying attention. And by then I was paying attention to everything. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That's why no one noticed when mine began. At work, I had access to public financial databases, property records, corporate filings, tools I used daily for clients. I understood exactly what was legal to access and what crossed ethical lines. I've built my career on staying on the right side of that line. So I stayed there. Everything I reviewed about Claudia was public record. Property filings, refinancing dates, lien notices. Business registrations are connected to her name. The first time I searched, my hands didn't shake. I wasn't nervous. I was clinical. Her house had been refinanced 3 times in 2 years. That alone isn't catastrophic. Many people refinance during rate fluctuations, but the pattern was compressed. Short intervals, increasing principal amounts. Then I found a small business registration under a variation of her name, a consulting venture she had never mentioned to the family. It had been dissolved within 14 months. No public explanation. Then came something more telling, a lien filing tied to a contractor dispute. Again, not criminal, not scandalous, but financially stressful. I sat back in my chair and felt a quiet clarity settle in. The narrative she had built about me, unstable, overwhelmed, fragile, had grown during the exact window when her own financial structure was becoming unstable. It wasn't a coincidence. It was displacement. Still, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt confirmed. Over the next several weeks, I continued reviewing records periodically, slowly, methodically. I created a timeline in my notebook. March, first refinance. June, business registered. November, business dissolved. January, second refinance. April, lien filed. July, third refinance. August onward, increased commentary about my financial stress. The alignment was almost precise. And here's what mattered most. I didn't need to exaggerate anything. Truth is heavy enough on its own. Meanwhile, at family gatherings, I maintained the same rhythm. I listened more than I spoke. I let Claudia continue narrating. She's very private about her finances, she said once when someone asked about investment strategies. I sipped my water and said nothing. Not because I agreed, because I didn't need to correct her yet. There's a psychological phenomenon I've observed in compliance work. People who construct protective narratives often escalate them subtly over time. They grow confident that no one will challenge them. Claudia began speaking more definitively. She's had a hard couple of years. She's rebuilding. She's doing better now. Rebuilding from what? I had never fallen. But I let the statements hang, because I was building something too. Not revenge, position. I consulted no lawyers. I didn't leak information. I didn't send anonymous emails. That would have been reactive. Instead, I asked myself a single question. If the truth needs to surface, what is the cleanest way for it to do so? The answer wasn't dramatic. It was simple, public context. If someone repeatedly frames another person as financially unstable, the credibility of that framing collapses the moment their own instability becomes visible in neutral daylight. Not exposed maliciously, revealed factually. I didn't need to invent anything. I didn't need insider data. Public records were enough. The key wasn't destruction. It was timing and audience. And timing requires patience. So I waited. I continued documenting comments. I refined the financial timeline. I memorized dates. What they never noticed was that while they were adjusting to the version of me Claudia had created, I was adjusting to the version of her reality she hoped no one would examine. She thought I was shrinking. In reality, I was aligning. The moment hadn't arrived yet. But when it did, it would be calm, precise, and irreversible. The final piece didn't come from a database. It came from a conversation I wasn't meant to hear fully. It was early spring. My parents were hosting a small Sunday lunch. Nothing formal, just immediate family. I arrived a little early, as usual. The front door was unlocked, so I let myself in quietly. Voices drifted from the kitchen. Claudia's voice, lower than her usual social tone. "I just need a little more time," she was saying. "The bank is being unreasonable." My father murmured something I couldn't catch. Then Claudia again, sharper now. "It's not mismanagement. It was timing, and I'm handling it." There was a pause. A chair scraped. I stepped into the hallway deliberately so my footsteps would be heard before I entered the kitchen. I have no interest in eavesdropping theatrically. If I'm going to know something, I prefer to know it cleanly. By the time I rounded the corner, Claudia's posture had shifted, shoulders squared, smile reconstructed. "There she is," she said brightly, "right on time." The conversation moved on to neutral topics. Salad dressing, weather, travel. But I had heard enough. Later that afternoon, while everyone sat in the living room discussing summer plans, my father casually asked Claudia how things were going with the refinance. She laughed lightly. "Oh, just optimizing. Interest rates are ridiculous." Optimizing. It was such a careful word. I didn't speak, I just observed. 2 days later, I checked the updated filings. A new entry had appeared. Notice of delinquency tied to the second refinance. Not foreclosure, not a disaster, but pressure. Real pressure. I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I felt vindicated, but because something inside me settled. It wasn't speculation anymore. Her financial structure was strained. And during that exact period, she had intensified the narrative of my instability. There's something sobering about confirmation. It strips away drama. What remains is clarity. I closed my laptop and didn't reopen it for hours. This was the private reveal, not to anyone else, but to myself. I understood her leverage, and I understood mine. Leverage isn't about humiliation, it's about balance. For over a year, the balance of perception had tilted against me. She shaped the narrative. I absorbed it. The family adjusted accordingly. Now the equilibrium had shifted, but I didn't feel triumphant. I felt responsible. Because once you hold information that can alter perception, you face a moral decision. Why would you use it? If I revealed her financial strain purely to embarrass her, I would become the aggressor. If I used it recklessly, I'd fracture the family in ways that couldn't be repaired. But if I allowed her narrative about me to continue unchecked, I would be complicit in my own erosion. I spent several evenings walking alone after work, thinking. The question wasn't whether the truth existed. It was whether the truth needed an audience. And if it did, what kind of audience? A private confrontation would allow her to deny, deflect, or reshape it. She was skilled at that. I had watched her do it repeatedly with my identity. A public setting would eliminate distortion, but it carried weight. I opened my black leather notebook and wrote a single sentence. If someone builds power by narrating you falsely, the only correction strong enough is context. They cannot narrate over. I didn't add exclamation points. I didn't underline it. I just closed the notebook. For the first time in a year, I felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not fear. Control, not over her. Over myself. And I knew the next move couldn't be impulsive. It had to be deliberate. Because once the truth stepped into the room, it wouldn't whisper. It would settle. And settling is harder to ignore. There's a moment before any irreversible decision where everything feels suspended. You can still walk away. You can still choose peace. You can still pretend you don't see what you see. I stood in that moment for nearly 3 weeks. During that time, Claudia continued exactly as she always had. At a cousin's birthday dinner, she mentioned casually that I'd been rebuilding financially after a stressful period. No one asked what period. The phrasing implied history, difficulty, recovery. I didn't correct her. Not because I agreed, because I was deciding. There were multiple paths available to me. Option 1, confront her privately. I could invite her to coffee, lay out the timeline, tell her I knew about the refinances, the lien, the delinquency notice. Ask her to stop speaking about me in ways that suggest instability. But I already knew how that would go. She would smile gently. She would say I misunderstood. She would suggest I was being defensive. And afterward, the narrative would evolve into something new. Aria is paranoid. Aria is sensitive. Aria is imagining attacks. Private confrontation favors the more socially dominant storyteller. Option 2, do nothing. Continue living my life. Let my career speak for itself. Allow time to erode her credibility naturally. That would be the most peaceful route, but it wouldn't repair the erosion that had already happened. Perception, once planted, lingers. And the longer I stayed silent, the more cemented the role became. Option 3, introduce context publicly. Not accusations, not emotional revelations. Context, the kind that cannot be reshaped because it exists in documentation. The question was timing. The family reunion in late summer was approaching, a larger gathering, a mix of immediate and extended relatives, a setting where narratives solidify, where impressions are reinforced. If the truth needed air, that was where it would breathe. I wasn't looking to humiliate her. I kept repeating that to myself because intention matters. I wasn't interested in dragging her through shame, but I was no longer willing to carry hers. The final catalyst came unexpectedly. My mother called one evening, voice careful. Claudia mentioned you might be considering selling your condo, she said gently. She said things have been tight for you. Tight. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the wall. I'm not selling, I replied calmly, and nothing is tight. A pause. Well, she seemed concerned. Of course she did. That was the moment the suspension ended. It wasn't about pride anymore. It wasn't even about reputation. It was about correction. If I allowed her to escalate the narrative to the point where my own parents doubted my stability, I would lose more than my image. I would lose credibility in the only circle that had known me my entire life. I opened my notebook that night and wrote, reunion, full family present, financial discussion inevitable. Then I outlined something simple, not a speech, not a confrontation, a question, because sometimes the cleanest exposure isn't a declaration. It's a request for clarity that forces someone else to explain. The decision wasn't emotional, it was structural. If she had used the audience to frame me, then the audience would also witness the correction. Irreversible doesn't mean explosive. It means once said, it cannot be unsaid. And I was ready for that weight. Once the decision was made, everything became quieter inside me. Not tense, not anxious. Focused. The reunion was scheduled for the last weekend of August at my uncle's lake house, a large, open-plan space where conversations carried easily from kitchen to living room to patio. If there was ever a place where narratives circulated effortlessly, it was there. I didn't rehearse a speech. I don't believe in speeches during family gatherings. They feel theatrical, defensive. Instead, I refined my facts. I printed nothing. I brought no folders. That would suggest aggression. What I carried was memory. Dates, public filings, refinance timelines, lien notices. All verifiable, all accessible to anyone willing to look. At work, I operated as usual. At home, I continued my routines. Morning runs, balanced meals, weekly calls with my parents. Outwardly, nothing shifted. That was important, because the power of correction lies in contrast. If I appeared reactive or emotional beforehand, it would confirm the narrative she'd built. So I stayed steady. 2 weeks before the reunion, Claudia escalated slightly. During a family group chat conversation about travel expenses for the gathering, she wrote, "Let's keep things modest this year. Not everyone is in a position to contribute comfortably." A pause. Then a separate message. "Aria, don't feel pressured to pitch in beyond what's manageable." The message gathered sympathetic reactions. A few relatives added, "Of course, and no stress." I stared at my phone. The implication was clear. I was the one in financial strain. I replied simply, "I'm happy to contribute my equal share." No emoji, no explanation. She didn't respond. That silence told me everything. The week of the reunion, I visited my parents for dinner. Claudia was there, helping my mother pack desserts to bring along. She moved around the kitchen confidently, issuing gentle instructions, adjusting containers. At one point, she turned to me. "Are you excited for the weekend?" she asked. "Yes," I said evenly. She studied my face for a fraction of a second, searching for something. Nerves, maybe? Hesitation. I gave her neither. Silence, when steady, can feel like a mirror. People begin to see themselves reflected in it. The night before the reunion, I opened my notebook one last time. I reviewed my timeline, not because I doubted it, but to ensure precision. I wrote down the sequence in bullet form, committing it fully to memory. First refinance, March. Business registered June. Business dissolved November. Lien filed April. Second refinance January. Delinquency notice early August. Then I closed the notebook and placed it back in its drawer. I didn't bring it with me. This wasn't about proving something with paper. It was about introducing a fact at the exact moment a narrative tried to expand. The reunion began like every other year. Laughter echoing across the lake, children running down the dock, adults debating grilling techniques. Claudia moved easily between groups, glass of white wine in hand, smiling widely. And I watched, not like a predator, not like a victim, like someone who understood timing. Because when the conversation inevitably turned to finances, as it always does when interest rates and housing markets are discussed, I would not interrupt. I would not accuse. I would ask. And a well-placed question, delivered calmly, can unravel more than anger ever could. The consequences had not begun yet, but the stage was set, and once context enters a room, it doesn't leave quietly. It happened on the second evening. Dinner had ended. Plates were stacked. The sun was dissolving into the lake, turning the water copper. Conversations naturally divided, some on the patio, others in the living room where ceiling fans hummed softly. I was seated near the edge of the sectional sofa, half listening as my uncle spoke about rising property taxes. Someone mentioned mortgage rates climbing again. It was inevitable. Claudia leaned forward, wine glass balanced delicately in her hand. "That's why you have to be careful," she said. "Some people jump into refinancing without fully understanding the long-term consequences." A subtle pause. She glanced at me. "I've seen how stressful that can be for younger homeowners." There it was, clean, public, positioned. A few heads turned in my direction, not accusatory, just curious. This was the moment. I didn't rush. I didn't interrupt her mid-sentence. I let the silence stretch just enough to feel natural. Then I spoke calmly. "I actually agree," I said. "Refinancing multiple times in a short period can create significant pressure, especially if there are lien filings involved." The room shifted, not dramatically, just perceptibly. Claudia's fingers tightened slightly around her glass. "I'm sorry?" she asked lightly. I kept my tone even, informational. "I was reviewing public filings recently for work," I continued. "It's interesting how patterns show up. For example, when a property is refinanced 3 times within 2 years, combined with a contractor lien and a delinquency notice, it usually indicates strain." Silence, not explosive, not chaotic. "Heavy." My uncle frowned slightly. 3 times? I nodded gently. "Yes, March, January, and again mid-year. It's all public record." Claudia's smile faltered for the first time in years, just a fraction. "That sounds specific," she said. "It is," I replied. No accusation, no raised voice. Just presence. My father shifted in his seat. "Wait," he said slowly. "Are you talking about your place, Aria?" I looked at him directly. "No, I refinanced once 2 years ago." Another pause. And then gently, so gently it almost felt like kindness, I added, "I think it's important we're accurate when we talk about financial stability, especially publicly." The words landed without force, but they landed. Claudia's posture changed. Shoulders pulled inward. The confident lean disappeared. "I don't know what you're implying," she said, a thin edge entering her voice. "I'm not implying anything," I answered, "just referencing public information." The room had gone still. No one reached for their phones. No one laughed. Because this wasn't a spectacle. It was context. And context doesn't need volume. My cousin Daniel spoke first. "Wait, are those filings about you, Aunt Claudia?" The question hung there, simple, direct. Claudia opened her mouth, then closed it. "It's complicated," she said finally. "You don't understand the full picture." I nodded once. "You're right," I said, "which is why it's risky to simplify other people's situations too." The sentence wasn't sharp. It wasn't cruel. It was symmetrical. For the first time in over a year, the narrative shifted without me defending myself, without pleading, without explaining my stability. Because once her own financial strain became visible, even as a question, the authority she had been using to define me thinned instantly. No one accused her of lying. No one attacked. But something changed in the room. The lens flipped, and you can feel that shift before anyone says it out loud. The consequences had begun, not explosive, not humiliating, just undeniable. The rest of that evening unfolded without raised voices, which in some ways made it more powerful. After Daniel's question, Claudia attempted to regain footing. "It's just restructuring," she said, waving her hand lightly. "Everyone refinances. Aria of all people knows that." Her tone aimed for casual, but something beneath it trembled. "Yes," I agreed calmly. "Refinancing once is common. Repeated restructuring under lien pressure is different." I didn't say it with accusation. I said it the way I would explain risk exposure in a meeting room. Analytical, neutral, And neutrality in that moment was devastating, because there was nothing for her to fight. My uncle cleared his throat. "Lean pressure?" he asked slowly. Claudia's eyes flicked toward him, then toward my father. "It was a contractor dispute," she said quickly. "It's resolved." The speed of her answer said more than the content. My father leaned back, processing. "You never mentioned that." Claudia's composure thinned further. "It wasn't necessary," she said. "I didn't want to burden anyone." The irony hovered in the air. For over a year, she had gently burdened the family with concern about me. My supposed fragility, my imaginary instability, my rebuilding. Now, under quiet scrutiny, she positioned herself as the protector, the one who withheld stress to shield others. I didn't interrupt, because the room no longer belonged to me. It belonged to reality. Daniel stood and walked to the kitchen. A minute later, I heard the soft tap of his phone against the counter, searching. Public records are quick to access. He returned slowly. "There's a delinquency notice from earlier this month," he said carefully. Not accusing, just reading. Claudia's face drained of color. "That's being handled," she replied. But the confidence had evaporated. And here's the part that surprised me most. No one attacked her. No one shouted. No one mocked. Instead, concern, real concern, began to surface. "Why didn't you tell us?" my mother asked gently. "We could have helped," my uncle added. Help, the word she had been assigning to me for a year, now redirected. Claudia's eyes flickered toward me, not angry, not furious. Exposed. "You've misunderstood everything," she said quietly. I held her gaze. "I don't think I have," I replied. "And I don't think you misunderstood me either." It wasn't an accusation. It was an acknowledgement. The room felt different now, not chaotic, not divided, recalibrated. For the first time in months, I wasn't the subject of whispered concern. I wasn't the fragile one who needed monitoring. I wasn't the unreliable narrator of my own life. The authority she had been using to frame me had dissolved under simple visibility. And that's the part no one can reverse. You can apologize for words. You can explain motives. But once the room has seen a contradiction, it doesn't unsee it. Claudia could try to reframe later. She could call relatives privately. She could soften the story. But the shift had happened collectively. And collective realization is irreversible. By the time the evening ended, conversations had moved on to logistics. Budgets, payment plans, next steps. Not about me, about her. I stood by the window, looking out at the dark lake, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not victory, balance. She hadn't been humiliated. But she could no longer define me. And sometimes, that's enough. The direct conversation didn't happen that night. It happened the next morning. The lake was quiet at dawn. Most of the family was still asleep. I was sitting at the edge of the dock with a cup of coffee, watching the water settle into pale blue stillness. I heard footsteps behind me. Claudia. She didn't sit immediately. She stood a few feet away, arms folded, not defensive, just contained. "That was unnecessary," she said finally. Her voice wasn't sharp, it was tired. I took a slow sip of coffee before responding. "What part?" I asked. She exhaled softly. "You could have talked to me privately." I nodded once. I considered that. She waited for more. "But you didn't correct me privately," I continued evenly. "You shaped perceptions publicly." There was no accusation in my tone, just symmetry. She looked out at the water. "I was worried about you," she said. "Were you?" I asked gently. A long pause followed. "I may have exaggerated," she admitted. "You're very reserved. People misinterpret that." "I know," I said. But the misinterpretation didn't start on its own. That landed. She shifted her weight, finally sitting down at the edge of the dock, leaving space between us. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said quietly. I believed her, not because the damage was small, but because intention and impact aren't always aligned. "I don't think you set out to hurt me," I replied. "But you did." Another pause, the kind that isn't hostile, just honest. "You think I was projecting," she said, almost to herself. "I think you were under pressure," I answered. "And it was easier to let concern settle on me than on you." Her jaw tightened slightly, but she didn't deny it. "When people believe someone else is unstable," I continued calmly, "they don't look too closely at you." The water lapped quietly against the dock. "I've always held this family together," she said after a moment. "They rely on me." "That doesn't require redefining me," I replied. There was no heat between us, no raised voices, no tears, just two adults sitting with consequences. "You could have embarrassed me," she said. "I didn't," I answered. She glanced at me then, really looked at me. I know, that acknowledgement mattered, because the line between exposure and humiliation is intention. "I don't need you to defend me," I said gently, "but I do need you to stop narrating me." She absorbed that. "And if I don't?" she asked, not challenging, just testing the boundary. I met her eyes steadily. "Then I won't stay silent next time either. No threat, no drama, Just clarity. She looked away first. I won't, she said. The conversation ended there. No hug, no reconciliation scene. But something fundamental had shifted. Not because I won, not because she lost, but because the imbalance had been corrected without explosion. And sometimes, that kind of confrontation, the one without heat, is the only kind that actually changes anything. It's been a year since that weekend at the lake house. If you came to one of our family dinners now, you wouldn't see tension. You wouldn't see fractured relationships or icy silence. On the surface, everything looks almost the same. But the energy is different. No one prefaces my accomplishments with concern anymore. When I mention work, people ask specific questions, curious ones. When finances come up, I'm included naturally in the conversation. Not as someone fragile, not as someone recovering, as someone competent. Claudia still hosts holidays. She still tells stories. She still occupies space comfortably. But there's a noticeable shift in how she speaks about me. She doesn't narrate. If someone asks about my life, she says, "You should ask Aria." It sounds simple, but it's profound. For most of my life, I thought quiet strength meant absorbing misrepresentation without reacting. I believed dignity was proven by endurance. Now I understand something more nuanced. Dignity isn't passive. It's intentional. I didn't become louder after that reunion. I didn't start dominating conversations or correcting every offhand comment. I didn't transform into someone sharp or intimidating. I remained myself, but I stopped shrinking. If someone makes an inaccurate statement now, even subtly, I correct it gently in real time. That's not quite right. Actually, here's what happened. I don't experience it that way. No edge, no defensiveness, just authorship. Because that's what I reclaimed. Authorship of my own narrative. I've also softened in ways I didn't expect. Not toward Claudia specifically, but toward myself. I no longer question whether I imagine things. I trust my perception. If a pattern feels off, I examine it instead of dismissing it. And interestingly, my relationship with Claudia isn't hostile. It's quieter. She has stabilized financially, slowly, responsibly. She doesn't discuss it publicly, and I don't either. That's her story to manage. We don't pretend the late conversation never happened, but we don't rehash it either. There's an unspoken understanding between us now. I will not be positioned, and she knows I mean that. The biggest change, though, isn't how my family sees me. It's how I see myself. I used to think being underestimated was harmless, even useful. It kept expectations low. It allowed me to operate without scrutiny. But invisibility, when prolonged, erodes something subtle inside you. You begin to doubt your own solidity. Now I feel solid. Not louder, not harsher. Just present. And presence, steady, grounded presence, changes how people approach you. I didn't destroy my aunt. I didn't win a dramatic battle. I introduced context where there had been a distortion, and then I stepped back. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to overpower someone. It's to calmly refuse the role they assigned you. When people hear the title of this story, they expect drama. They expect shouting across a dining table, public humiliation, a triumphant takedown. But that's not what this was. This was about correction. There's a difference between revenge and rebalancing. Revenge wants spectacle. It wants the other person to feel small. It's loud and often satisfying in the moment, but it rarely restores dignity. Rebalancing is quieter. It doesn't aim to destroy. It aims to realign perception with reality. For over a year, I allowed someone else to narrate me because I believed silence was maturity. I believed restraint would speak for itself. But silence, when misused, becomes permission. The lesson I learned isn't that you should expose people the moment they cross you. And it's not that you should gather evidence like a weapon. It's this: if someone repeatedly defines you inaccurately in public, the correction must also live in public. Not as humiliation, not as punishment, but as context. Truth doesn't need theatrics. It just needs timing and calm. What mattered most wasn't that my family discovered my aunt's financial strain. It was that they discovered I wasn't the unstable one. I didn't defend myself emotionally. I didn't argue point by point. I introduced one accurate thread and let it pull the rest loose. Since then, I've carried one quiet rule with me: I will not shrink from preserving someone else's image. That doesn't mean I attack. It doesn't mean I expose everything I know. It means I don't accept roles that diminish me. If you've ever been the quiet one in your family, the dependable one, the one people speak about instead of speaking to, I want you to know this. You don't need to become louder to be respected, but you do need to become clear. And sometimes clarity requires courage at exactly the moment everyone expects you to stay silent. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever let someone else define you just to keep the peace? And if so, what would it look like to calmly take that authorship back?